Back to the heat. Greece received a financial lifeline this week after accepting austerity measures mandated by European creditors to stay in the Eurozone. The approval by the Greek Parliament is expected to clear the way for Greece's third financial bailout in 5 years, worth an estimated $94 billion. Joining us now from Athens is Aristides Hatzis. He's an associate professor of law and economics at the University of Athens. From London, we're joined by Vicky Pryce. She's an economist and author of Greekonomics, the Euro Crisis and Why Politicians Just Don't Get It. And also with us from London is Martin Sandbuon. He's the economics writer with the Financial Times. Thanks all for joining us. Let's go to Athens first. Aristides, austerity. Just how bad is it when it comes to daily life in Greece and on the streets of Athens for ordinary Greeks?
It's very bad. It's very bad. These are hard times for the Greek people. The Greek GDP fell very steeply by 26 to 27%. There is unemployment reaching 26 or 27%. The unemployment between young men and women are ferocious, more than 60%. And the Greek debt increased because of the fall of the GDP to 175 to 180% of GDP. All these numbers are awful.
Vicky in London, these are grim numbers. Why is the Eurozone sticking with this austerity package, considering a lot of numbers say it just hasn't worked?
I think the problem with the Eurozone in particular has been that each country is particularly concerned about their own voters, and they're looking at domestic issues rather than worrying particularly about the sort of combined benefit that could come to the Eurozone from having slightly better policies for Greece. So far, the austerity measures have been disastrous, and yet what we're seeing is that there is even more push to get the fiscal side to move in such a way that Greece can perhaps sort of sustain itself in the future, but in reality what it will do in the short term is cause even more decline in output. And we're seeing this year. Instead of forecasts of 3% being in fact achieved for growth this year, we're likely to have a decline of 3%, if not more. And the same will happen next year, given those measures. So we are seeing a lack of collective responsibility across the Eurozone. And we're also seeing everyone sticking to what they think works, despite the fact the evidence suggests that it doesn't. In other words, austerity has been bad for Greece and for a number of other countries in the Eurozone, in fact.
Martin Sandbuon in London also. Austerity hasn't worked, or is it just the Greek government that haven't put in the necessary reforms over the last few years? What's your view?
Well, it's probably a bit of both, but to pick up on what Vicky Pryce just said, it's true that politicians play to their domestic voters, but politicians across the Eurozone have also been telling their voters that there is no alternative, that first of all, you need to bail out Greece. That's what they were told in 2010. Otherwise, everything would end in disaster, like after Lehman. I don't think that was true. And in fact, a lot of what we've seen since came from the mistake of bailing out Greece in 2010 instead of letting it default inside the Eurozone. And at the same time, they're saying, of course, if we lend money, we need to set conditions, and these are the conditions that the Greeks need to fulfill. It's true that the Greek government hasn't fulfilled a lot of the things that they were told to do. Sometimes, well, they have done a lot of the things they were told to do, including austerity, which has had bad effects. Other times they have dragged their feet, but we should remember that the creditors, time after time, did sign off on consecutive reviews of the previous two bailouts and basically said, okay, we'll give you the next tranche. So everyone is to blame here, partly for agreeing a bad program to start with, and partly for carrying it out in a really counterproductive way.
Aristides, are the Greek people ready to go through another round of austerity? You know, these votes we're seeing are really only about discussions going forward. This whole deal could fall apart and the reforms could not be implemented, and suddenly we're back at square one. Is this the last chance for austerity to work?
Actually, I don't think that austerity is going to work. We have to say a few things about Greek people's attitude towards the austerity measures. Actually, there was a referendum The referendum was a big mistake, a great political mistake by the Greek government, because it was used the wrong way. The Greek government thought that this can be used as a strong bargaining chip, and it backfired. However, there is another problem, and I think that we should also blame the Greek government for this austerity mix. According to a recent study by Alessina and his colleagues at Harvard University, there are different effects of different austerity mixes. And the worst mix is the mix with excessive tax hikes. And this is the mix that Greece adopted. And this was the result of Greece's government preference for tax hikes instead of spending cuts,
right,
of public spending cuts.
Vicky, in London, it's got so bad, this austerity, with the view of austerity, that even the IMF is now saying, look, this isn't going to work. We need haircuts, i.e. debt cancellation, debt forgiveness as well. But it doesn't seem Europe is listening. Do you think they're going to change their mind, considering this implementation of these reforms looks questionable at best?
I think they're going to have to. The interesting thing is that we've already heard Draghi, who is the head of the European Central Bank, saying himself, he said that yesterday actually in his press conference, that the Greek debt is unsustainable, something needs to happen to it, everyone knows it, so it is going to happen. And I think everything the IMF has said recently would suggest to me that there is now going to be an inevitable relook at the Greek debt situation. Remember, of course, it's not just Greece. A number of countries after the financial crisis and the bailouts have been left with huge debts to GDP ratios. So even Ireland, which is supposed to be the sort of amazing recovery country after a bailout, has been left with a debt to GDP ratio of over 110, between 110 and 120%.
Yeah,
and Portugal similarly.
I want to follow up with that with Martin too. What's the examples in the rest of Europe in terms of austerity working? People cite Ireland, Portugal, but of course there's still massive debt loads in some of those countries.
I think it's a very important distinction there between the amount of outstanding debt, the stock of debt, economists would say, and the annual budget. So one thing is you might be balancing your budget on a yearly basis, but still have huge debts hanging over you from the past. And that's really the situation in a lot of European countries. And it's actually the situation in Greece. For the last 2 years, until the latest economic catastrophe of the last few months, the government in Athens was balancing its books in terms of covering domestic spending with its own tax revenue, before you count interest spending on the outstanding debt. But even that was not all that much. The big problem was really this mountain of obligations that notionally at least have to be repaid. The question is, when do they have to be repaid? And all the politics this year have really been driven by the fact that there were these very steep payment deadlines coming up this summer. As we know, on July the 20th, there is a big bond that has to be paid back to the European Central Bank. So it was these payment cliffs that made things very difficult. On an everyday basis, day-to-day basis, the Greek government has actually been living within its means for 2 years now. So the problem is the mountain, the debt overhang, that has to be fixed. The IMF is right, Mario Draghi is right. The big political discussion is, do you do that by actually reducing the official outstanding amount, or do you just extend it so far into the future at low interest rates that it becomes bearable? And that's, if there is a dirty deal that is struck in the next weeks or months, it will take that form of long extensions and low interest rates.
This may be simple, but don't you pay interest rates because there's a risk attached with lending money, and that creditors in a rush to lend to Greece maybe should more have looked at what they were getting into and now accept a haircut, a reduction in their payments? After all, some would say in Europe, France and Germany have had debt forgiveness after the Second World War, and some structural reforms that Germany is asking Greece to do, it won't even do itself, like opening stores on Sunday.
This is a very reasonable argument, and historically reasonable, and at the same time, it's economically sound. For me, the recipe for Greece is rather simple. A generous debt relief in the way that Martin has just described, with the extension of grace period, with the extension of maturities. The IMF proposal was great for me, not only as Greek, but also as an economist. The second thing is less taxes. I mean, taxes are strangling the Greek economy. And this austerity, the third bailout agreement, is full of taxes. The third, reforms, pro-market structural reforms. Why? Because Greece is not a free market economy. It is characterized by every ranking in the book as a mostly unfree economy. Greece needs an institutional framework that it is going to be friendly, conducive to economic growth, because now it doesn't have one. And finally, public spending cuts. There is this argument that I consider it economically stupid that says that these public spending cuts are going to have recessionary effects. Yes, but one should also consider and compare the recessionary effect of not enforcing reforms for the past 5 years, of not implementing these reforms, of not sticking with these reforms. So we need reforms because this is, after all, a choice between temporary recession and permanent recession.
Vicky, is it a question of either or, though, drastic reforms that have to happen quickly, or, of course, nothing? Can't we have a bit of both?
Well, the truth is that, of course we can, and we should have fed them. But it is unrealistic to expect a country whose GDP is collapsing to have serious reforms implemented. It's just impossible. It's been proven to be the case with Greece, and we've seen this elsewhere as well. The other thing is, of course, that Greece has no proper welfare system. Whatever people are saying outside of Greece in terms of its supposedly generous pension regime. In reality, the vast majority of people who are unemployed have no unemployment benefit. You lose your health insurance the moment you lose your job. There isn't a support mechanism to allow some of these reforms to happen. So I think to expect Greece to suddenly become more like some of the other countries, not forgetting, of course, that many of the other countries haven't implemented very many reforms themselves. If you look at Spain, frankly, if you look at France, if you look at Italy, and yet Italy and France are allowed as big countries to have a leeway in terms of when they meet some of their conditions. And that's quite interesting. There's a different rule, it seems, for the big countries and a different one for the small ones. That does not mean we mustn't do reform. We absolutely have to. We have to be realistic in terms of how quickly the impact of that can be on the economy.
Martin, last word from you. We remember the financial crisis here in Washington, huge amounts of stimulus in the US government. In China, too, there was massive amounts of stimulus. That seemed to work. Why is Europe going the other way so much?
I think, unfortunately, it's linked to precisely the politics of bailout. Once you ask somebody for money, you don't really have much alternative than do what they say. In the Eurozone, Germany was the paymaster of many of the other countries. It is the biggest country, the richest economy. So, of course, it had the greatest say in what policy would be pursued. And as it saw it, the German political and economic establishment, fiscal austerity and tight money were the best ways to achieve growth, at least in the long run. It was also necessary to keep the pressure on for reforms in the peripheral countries, and that's why I think you had an unhealthy influence on the policymaking for the Eurozone as a whole. So instead of cutting the places where, you had to cut, everyone had to cut their budgets, and of course the monetary policy was also too tight.